I still don't know if I'm doing the right thing by telling this story. 20 years of silence weighs heavily on you, but some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone. And perhaps by sharing this, I can finally put down mine. My name is Dr. Emmanuel Okafor. I've been practicing medicine in Boston for the past 2 decades, but my story begins at Lagos University Teaching Hospital in Nigeria, where I once believed I could change my country's healthcare system from within. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you has haunted me for 20 years. It's about a patient, a 12-year-old boy named Chibuike, who died not from his illness, but from a system that failed him, and how his death became the reason I left everything behind. If you're already feeling drawn into this story, that's exactly what the Listening Room 808 is about. Real, raw confessions that make us think about our own lives. Hit the subscribe button to join us on this journey weekly, because trust me, these confessions from strangers across the world might just change how you see your own life. Now, let's get back into it. I was 32, 5 years into my career as a pediatric specialist at Luth. Despite the challenges, the power outages, the equipment shortages, the overcrowding, I was determined to serve my country. I'd turned down 3 international offers already. Nigeria needs its doctors, I would say, with the righteous conviction of youth. Then Chibuike came into my life. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in April 2003, carried in his mother's arms, though he was nearly as tall as her. His eyes were yellow, his belly distended. Malaria had progressed to liver involvement, serious but treatable. I admitted him immediately. "Doctor, will my son be okay?" His mother, Amara, asked me. She was a school teacher, educated, cautious. "We'll do everything we can," I assured her, believing it with my whole heart. What I didn't know then was how those words would come back to haunt me. Most doctors will tell you not to get attached to patients. It's the first lesson they teach in medical school, right after the Hippocratic Oath. But sometimes, a patient breaks through your defenses. Chibuike was brilliant. Between treatments, he would solve complex math equations I brought him. He wanted to be an engineer, to build bridges across Lagos's lagoons that wouldn't collapse during the rainy season. He had plans, this child, dreams that deserved to be realized. His mother brought his books every day, and I'd often find them working on his studies together. Sometimes I'd join them after my rounds. "Dr. Emmanuel, I have a question about force and mass," he'd say, and for a few minutes, I'd be a student alongside him, relearning physics I'd long forgotten. I never told anyone this, but he reminded me of my younger brother who had died of typhoid when we were children. Perhaps that's why I broke the cardinal rule. I let myself care too much. The initial treatment was working. After 5 days, Chibuike's eyes were clearing, his fever subsiding. I was discussing discharge plans with Amara when our hospital administrator called me aside. "Dr. Okafor, there's a problem with the boy's coverage," he said quietly. "The family's health insurance has rejected the claim. They've exceeded their annual limit." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "So what does that mean?" "It means they need to pay out of pocket for the remaining treatment and hospital stay." The amount he quoted was more than a teacher's annual salary. When I told Amara, she didn't cry. She just looked at me with determined eyes and said, "I'll find a way." The next morning, she brought in all her jewelry. The day after, the deed to a small plot of land her father had left her. It wasn't enough. We had to switch Chibuike to less effective medications, the ones covered by the hospital's charity program. His condition stabilized, but didn't improve. Then the power cuts began. Longer than usual that month. Our backup generator was meant to kick in, but it had been malfunctioning for weeks. The request for repairs had been filed 3 months earlier. During one blackout, Chibuike's IV pump stopped working. By the time we realized it, his medication had been interrupted for hours. His fever returned, worse than before. I filed urgent requests for the medications I knew would work. They were denied. Not covered, not in stock, requires special approval. I called colleagues at other hospitals, pulled in favors, brought medications from my personal emergency kit. It helped, but it wasn't enough. We needed sustained treatment, proper monitoring, functioning equipment. One night, I found Amara sleeping on the floor beside Chibuike's bed, her hand on his forehead. When she woke, she asked me, "Doctor in America, would my son be getting better?" I couldn't lie to her. "Yes," I said, "he would." 2 weeks after admission, Chibuike developed pneumonia, a complication we should have been able to prevent. We needed to move him to the ICU, but all beds were full. I argued, pleaded, nearly came to blows with another doctor whose patient I felt was less critical. I lost the argument. I stayed at Chibuike's bedside that night, manually pumping oxygen when his levels dropped. I called every contact I had, trying to find an ICU bed at another hospital. By morning, my voice was hoarse, my hope dwindling. Then came the moment that would change everything. During rounds, the chief of medicine stopped at Chibuike's bed. He reviewed the chart, glanced at the boy, then pulled me aside. "Emmanuel, you need to prepare the family. We've done what we can." "No," I said too loudly. "He was getting better. He just needs the right medications, a proper ICU, which we don't have. This is Luth, not Johns Hopkins. Be realistic." "Then transfer him somewhere that does." His expression softened slightly. "There is nowhere, Emmanuel. You know that. Now do your job and prepare the family." I watched him walk away, continuing rounds as if he hadn't just told me to prepare a mother for her child's death, a death that was entirely preventable. That afternoon, Chibuike had a lucid period. His eyes found mine, clear for the first time in days. "Dr. Emmanuel," he whispered, "am I going to die?" 20 years of medical practice haven't made that question any easier to answer. "I'm fighting for you," I said, which wasn't an answer at all. He nodded slightly. "If I die, will you help other children like me?" "You're not going to die," I insisted, even as the monitors told a different story. He smiled faintly. "Promise anyway." So I did. I promised a dying child that I would help others like him. At the time, I thought it meant working harder within the system, pushing for reforms, being a better doctor in Nigeria. I didn't understand that sometimes keeping a promise means making impossible choices. Chibuike died at 3:47 a.m. I was there, holding his hand. Amara had stepped out to pray in the hospital chapel. I couldn't find the strength to call her back in time. After pronouncing him dead, I sat beside his body, overwhelmed not just by grief, but by rage. Rage at the system, at our broken healthcare, at myself for being part of it. When Amara returned and saw her son, she didn't wail or collapse as many parents do. She simply placed her hand on his chest and said, "He's with God now." Then she looked at me with eyes that held no accusation, which somehow made it worse. "You did everything you could, doctor." But I hadn't. Not really. I'd worked within a broken system, followed its rules, accepted its limitations, and a child had died because of it. As I walked out of the hospital that morning, the April sun rising over Lagos, I made two decisions. I would leave Nigeria, and I would never again let a system determine which of my patients lived or died. 3 months later, I accepted a position at Boston Children's Hospital. I told my family it was for the professional opportunity. I told my colleagues it was for the research potential. I never told anyone it because of a promise made to a dying boy. The night before I left Nigeria, I visited Chibuike's grave. It was a simple plot, but Amara had planted yellow marigolds that brightened the red earth. I left my stethoscope there, the one I'd used throughout medical school and my early career. It felt right somehow, leaving that part of me behind. In Boston, I threw myself into pediatric care. I worked twice as hard as my colleagues, took on the most difficult cases, volunteered for extra shifts. Some called me dedicated, others obsessive. No one knew I was trying to save one patient, over and over again. 10 years into my American career, I established a foundation that partners with hospitals in Nigeria to provide critical care equipment and medication for children. We've helped thousands of patients who would have been in Chibuike's position. On paper, it's a success story. In my heart, it will never be enough. Last year, on the 20th anniversary of Chibuike's death, I received an email that nearly brought me to my knees. It was from Amara. "Dear Dr. Emmanuel," she wrote, "I don't know if you remember my son, Chibuike. He would have been 32 this year, the same age you were when you treated him." She'd tracked me down through the foundation, seen my name as founder, and connected the dots. She wasn't angry. She wanted me to know she'd established a small scholarship in Chibuike's name for students interested in engineering. She was proud of what I'd accomplished in Boston. She forgave me. But here's the truth. I've never spoken aloud until now. I don't deserve forgiveness. Because while I've helped countless children in my American career, I left behind millions in Nigeria who needed me just as much. The night I received Amara's email, I dreamt of Chibuike for the first time in years. In the dream, he was building a bridge, just as he'd always wanted. He looked up at me and said, It goes both ways, Dr. Emmanuel. I woke understanding what my subconscious was trying to tell me. A bridge connects two places, it doesn't abandon one for the other. So here is my confession. I broke under the weight of a broken system. I ran away instead of staying to fix it. I've told myself that I've done more good in Boston, with better resources and support, than I ever could have in Lagos. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps it's just what I need to believe to sleep at night. But I also know this. For every child I save in my high-tech American hospital, there's a Chibuike somewhere in Nigeria who won't make it because their doctor doesn't have the resources I do. The hardest part of being a doctor isn't making life or death decisions. It's living with them afterward. It's wondering, decades later, if you made the right choice. It's realizing that sometimes there is no right choice, just impossible ones. I've never returned to Nigeria. I tell myself it's because I'm too busy, but the truth is, I'm afraid. Afraid to see what I left behind. Afraid to face other doctors who stayed and fought the battles I abandoned. Afraid to walk the halls of Luth and be reminded of a promise I only partially kept. I'm 62 now. Retirement is on the horizon. Last week, a colleague asked where I plan to live after I leave Boston Children's. For the first time in 20 years, I answered honestly, I don't know. Maybe it's time to go home. I don't know if Nigeria will have me back. I don't know if I have the right to return. But I do know this. Bridges can be built at any age. And sometimes, keeping an old promise means making a new one. So here's my new promise. Not to Chibuike this time, but to myself. I will find a way to truly honor his memory. Not through guilt or running away, but by finally facing what I left behind. Because the patient I couldn't save didn't just change my life. He showed me that sometimes the system breaks more than patients. Sometimes it breaks the healers too. There are secrets we keep for others, and then there are secrets we keep from ourselves. Mine is both. For 15 years I've carried it across oceans and borders, from the dust of Kabul to the sterile halls of Toronto General Hospital. Today, thanks to the Listening Room 808, I finally speak it aloud. My name is Fatima Ahmadi. I was once a midwife at Rabia Balki Hospital in Kabul, Afghanistan. Now I deliver babies in one of Canada's top medical facilities. Patients here marvel at my calm during crisis, how I never seem rattled by complications. They don't know that every difficult birth in Toronto is easy compared to what I've seen. What I've done, what I ran from. This is the story of Mariam and her child, and why I left everything behind. Rabia Balki was not like the hospitals you see in the West. In 2007, we had limited electricity, sporadic running water, and equipment left over from the Soviet era. We delivered nearly 14,000 babies a year in a facility designed for 5,000. Women gave birth on metal tables, sometimes 2 to a room, separated only by a tattered curtain. I was 34 then, with 12 years of experience. I had trained under both Taliban rule, secretly in homes, and after their fall. I had delivered babies by candlelight during bombings. I had improvised equipment from household items. I was good at my job, one of the best. But in Afghanistan, being good at your job isn't always enough. Sometimes it puts you in impossible situations. It was a Tuesday in August when Mariam arrived, clutching her swollen belly, her brother-in-law 2 steps behind her. This alone was unusual. Typically, husbands or female relatives accompanied laboring women. She was young, maybe 20, with kohl-rimmed eyes that couldn't hide her fear. She is the second wife, her brother-in-law explained curtly. The first is home with my brother. This one's labor started early. I noticed bruises on her wrists, yellowing to green, old injuries. When I asked her name, she whispered, Mariam, as if she might be punished for speaking. As I examined her, I found more bruises on her thighs, her back. When I asked about them, her eyes darted to her brother-in-law, who had refused to leave the room. She fell, he said. She is clumsy. I'd heard this explanation 1,000 times. I never believed it. Her labor was progressing normally, but something felt wrong. Mariam flinched when touched. She wouldn't make eye contact. When I checked her cervix, I found evidence of previous trauma that wasn't from childbirth. While her brother-in-law stepped out to smoke, Mariam grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Please, she whispered, help me run away. They will kill me after this baby comes. In that moment, I made a fatal mistake. I believed her. What Miriam told me over the next 4 hours came in fragments, between contractions and careful monitoring of her brother-in-law's whereabouts. She had been sold as a second wife to a man 30 years her senior. The first wife, unable to have children, had chosen her specifically for breeding. But when Miriam became pregnant, the abuse worsened. The first wife would hold her down while the husband beat her. They controlled her food, her water, her movement. "The baby is a girl," she said. "I paid a technician at the ultrasound clinic to tell me secretly. They wanted a boy. When they find out..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I had heard stories like this before. Usually, I offered sympathy, perhaps a phone number for a women's organization that might help, though we all knew how limited that help would be. But something about Miriam was different. Perhaps it was her eyes, which reminded me of my younger sisters. Perhaps it was the burns I found on her palms, deliberate, circular marks from cigarettes. Perhaps it was simply that after years of helplessness, something in me finally broke. "I will help you," I said. I didn't know yet what that meant, but I had made a promise I couldn't take back. By midnight, a desperate plan had formed. The hospital had a basement exit that led to the street behind the building. My cousin's husband drove a taxi and could be trusted. I had savings, enough for Miriam to reach my aunt in Mazar-e Sharif, near the Uzbekistan border. From there, perhaps, to safety. Every part of this plan violated my professional ethics, the hospital's rules, and quite possibly the law. I knew this. I also knew I would never forgive myself if I sent Miriam back to that house. As her contractions intensified, so did my resolve. I told her to scream louder than necessary to buy us time and space. Her brother-in-law retreated to the hallway, uncomfortable with women's pain. Good. Just before 2 a.m., Miriam delivered a healthy baby girl, 3.2 kilograms, with a powerful set of lungs. As I placed the infant on her chest, Miriam looked at me with a mixture of love and terror. "They can't know," she whispered. "Please." And then I committed the act that has haunted me for 15 years. I cleaned the baby girl and wrapped her in a blanket. Then I stepped into the hallway where her brother-in-law was waiting. "There have been complications," I told him, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "The baby is in distress. I've sent Miriam for an emergency procedure. It will be several hours. You should go home and return in the morning." He argued, of course, demanded to see her. I stood firm, using all my authority as a medical professional, inventing terminology I knew he wouldn't understand. Finally, reluctantly, he left, but not before warning me that he would return at dawn with his brother. As soon as he was gone, I set our plan in motion. My cousin's husband was waiting at the back entrance. One of the night nurses, who had lost her own daughter to an abusive marriage, agreed to cover for me. I grabbed my savings from my locker, 6,500 Afghanis, about $130 USD, and added my gold bracelet, a gift from my mother. I helped Miriam, still bleeding and weak from childbirth, through the dark basement corridors. Her daughter, tightly swaddled, made no sound, as if she understood the need for silence. At the door, I hesitated. "If they find you, they will kill you," I said. "And if they discover I helped you, they might kill me too." Miriam's eyes, clear despite her physical pain, met mine. "Then we will die trying to live, instead of living while dying slowly." I watched the taxi disappear into the night, carrying Miriam, her daughter, and my complicity in what would soon be called a kidnapping. By morning, the hospital was in chaos. Miriam's husband had arrived with tribal elders and police. The story had already morphed. His wife and son had been kidnapped from the hospital. How could such a thing happen? Who was responsible? I played my part, showed them the delivery room, feigned distress and confusion. Suggested she might have left through the main entrance, while the night staff was handling an emergency in another ward. For 3 days, I maintained the lie. On the 4th day, they discovered the night nurse's involvement. Under interrogation, she broke and told them about my role, the basement door, the taxi. By then, I hoped Miriam was far away, but I couldn't be sure. That night, I packed one bag, called my brother, and left through the same basement door I had shown to Miriam. By morning, I was on a bus to Pakistan, with a passport I'd kept ready for years, just in case. From there to Turkey. Then, through channels I'd rather not detail, to Canada, where I claimed asylum. I told Canadian authorities almost everything. The abuse Miriam suffered, the threat to her life, my role in her escape. I omitted only the location I had sent her to, protecting my family who might still face consequences. My asylum case was approved. I recertified as a midwife. I built a new life, but I never forgot. For years, I searched for news about Mariam. Had she made it to safety? Was her daughter well? Had my family suffered for my actions? The internet had little to offer about individual cases in Afghanistan's remote provinces. In 2010, I received a letter from my aunt in Mazar-e-Sharif. Written carefully to avoid explicit details, it told me that the guests had arrived safely, but had continued their journey after only 2 days. Where they went, she didn't know, or wouldn't say. My family had been questioned, but not harmed. The tone was forgiving, but carried an undercurrent of reproach. Your actions put us all at risk. I never asked them to take that risk, but I had created the situation that made it inevitable. Another weight to carry. The heaviest burden, though, was doubt. Had I truly helped Mariam, or had I simply traded one dangerous situation for another? A woman alone with an infant running through a country at war. What were her real chances? Had I sent her into an even worse fate than the one she faced at home? In 2019, I returned to Afghanistan for the first time as part of a Canadian medical delegation. Kabul had changed. The weather, for better or worse, depended on where you looked. Rabia Balki Hospital had new equipment, funded by international aid, though still too little for the need. I visited under my married name, aware that my past actions might still have consequences. No one recognized me. Staff turnover had been complete in the 12 years I'd been gone. On my last day, I gathered my courage and asked about Mariam's family, claiming they were distant relatives of my husband. I learned that her father-in-law had died, and the family had moved to Herat. No one knew or would say what had happened to the kidnapped second wife and baby. As I left the hospital for the last time, a young cleaner stopped me in the hallway. "You're her, aren't you?" she whispered. The midwife who disappeared the same night as the second wife. My heart stopped. I considered denying it, but something in her eyes made me nod slightly. She pressed a folded paper into my hand. My mother was a nurse here back then. She said if you ever returned, I should give you this. Back in my hotel room, with shaking hands, I unfolded the note. Inside was a photograph of a young girl about 12 sitting at a school desk, and 3 handwritten lines. She is safe, she is learning, you did the right thing. No name, no location, just enough to let me breathe again. I've spent 15 years wondering if I betrayed my profession to follow my conscience, or betrayed my conscience by running away afterward. I've delivered over 3,000 babies in Canada, each birth a kind of atonement. I've trained younger midwives to recognize signs of abuse and to work within the system to address it. But I've never told them what I did that night in Kabul, until now. Last month, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read simply, "From Mariam's daughter." The message was brief. They had made it to Tajikistan, then eventually to Germany through a refugee program. Mariam had remarried. The daughter, named Fatima, after me, was now studying medicine. They were well. The final line read, "My mother says to tell you that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to do what's right." She named me after the woman who taught her that. I don't tell this story to justify what I did. In many ways I was lucky. Lucky that Mariam and her daughter survived, lucky that my family wasn't harmed, lucky that I found safety in Canada. It could have ended very differently for all of us. But I tell it because I've learned that healthcare isn't just about delivering babies or healing bodies. Sometimes it's about recognizing when systems fail the very people they're meant to protect. Sometimes the most important medical decision isn't which treatment to provide, but whether to step outside the rules that constrain our ability to truly help. I lost my home, my career, and my country, and contact with much of my family because of that night. But somewhere in Germany, a young woman studies medicine because I helped give her a chance at life. Her mother lives free from abuse because I risked everything on a desperate plan. Was it worth it? I ask myself this question every day. I still don't have a perfect answer. But when I received that email, when I saw that my gamble had given them both a future, I felt, for the first time in 15 years, that perhaps I could forgive myself. So this is my confession. I broke my professional oath to follow a more fundamental one. First, do no harm. In refusing to return Mariam to her abusers, I believe I honored that deeper commitment, even as I violated the letter of my professional ethics. The system in Afghanistan failed Mariam, as it has failed countless women. I couldn't change that system. Not then, perhaps not ever. But for one woman, one child, I could create an escape. And sometimes that has to be enough. Before we share the next story sitting in our mailbox, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here today. In the Listening Room, the Listening Room 808 is more than just a channel. It's a space where we can share our deepest regrets and learn from each other's experiences. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to join our growing community. Your support helps these important stories reach others who might need to hear them. And if you found value in today's story, leaving a like helps more people discover these conversations. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next upload when it drops. Also, if this story stirred something in you, if you found yourself thinking about a secret, a regret, or an experience that you've never shared, I'd like you to know the Listening Room 808 is here for you. Your story deserves to be heard. Whether it's a confession that's been weighing on your heart, a life-changing moment you've never spoken about, or a truth you need to finally let out, this is your space. Send your story to thelistener808@gmail.com. Share it anonymously if you prefer, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear exactly what you've been afraid to say. Remember, you've held on to that secret for too long. It's time to let it out. Here at the Listening Room 808, we listen, we don't judge.